So,
For you, yeah.
okay. Given my height. Okay, so the Northeast Pacific has been so is prone to have conditions of intense warming, also known as marine heat waves, which have been particularly pronounced over the last decade. And they've had also some significant ecosystem impacts, so that it's important to try to predict these conditions. And so, the figures on the left show the composite evolution of marine heat waves, so surface temperature and sea surface height, starting from 12 months prior to the onset time when the temperature passed a given threshold. And so you can see that the development of this condition are associated also with the large-scale anomaly, and particularly with the development of warm condition in the central equatorial Pacific. And so this connection with the large scale suggests that there may be large scale anomalies that can lead to can help anticipate the development of these conditions. So this study was an attempt to identify these initial conditions that optimally lead to the development of Northeast Pacific marine heat waves. And for this purpose, we use the linear inverse model, which is an empirical model that is derived from observation that includes both a deterministic component, the first term on the right-hand side, and also stochastic term. And in particular, for the purposes of this study, it also allows to identify initial conditions that really lead in an optimal sense to desired or final states of interest. And in this case, we used as a final state what is shown on the bottom right, which is the sea surface temperature at north of 25 north at the time when the marine heat wave, at the onset time, so when we passed the threshold that was chosen in this case. Now we have to move forward. Okay, so we did find initial conditions, which are the ones shown on the top in the blue box for these two variables that we chose to characterize our states. And in the panels below the blue box, you see the evolution of these fields at subsequent times, and you can see that in fact these conditions are associated with the warming in the Northeast Pacific, and also are associated with the development of ENSO precursors, and then the development of the Central Pacific El Niño conditions. And also, this methodology allows to diagnose the dynamical operator of this model, and so we investigated which particular modes of the system, climate modes dynamical modes are more important for the development of these marine heat waves. And we found that there was one specific mode that seemed to be particularly relevant, and this is associated with anomalies both in the Northeast Pacific along the coast, west coast of the US, and with this also anomalies in the Central Tropical Pacific. And we ended up defining it or terming it the NPCP mode. So the conclusions for the purpose of this workshop, I have three major points that I would like to leave you with. The first one is that the Northeast Pacific marine heat waves are associated with this large-scale climate variability that links the North and the tropical Pacific. Also, the Central Pacific El Niño condition develop concurrently with this Northeast Pacific marine heat waves and can increase the persistence of the marine heat waves. I haven't shown it here in these 5 minutes, but Tongtong there is a talk down the road that she's going to show that. So we have discussed this morning about the importance of ENSO for lending predictability along the West Coast. However, this shows how not all ENSO events are the same, and so the type of event is important, and also the specific evolution of the events also can play an important role. And finally, from a methodological perspective and in anticipation of tomorrow's session of modeling, I think the LIM, which is based on observation, can be viewed as a form of machine learning, can be actually a very powerful tool for both identifying optimal precursors. It's very useful, can be very useful for predictions, and also can allow this more diagnostic analysis that can maybe more transparently reveal the underlying dynamics. And that's it.
Awesome. We have Johnathan Evanilla.
All right, what's up? I'm Johnathan. I'm from the Bigelow Lab in Maine, and today I'll be talking about an ecological forecast we've been developing and delivering to stakeholders at a weekly timescale. So in the Gulf of Maine, there are annual blooms of a harmful algae called Alexandrium, and during these blooms, subsequently, there's biotoxin called PSP, or paralytic shellfish poison, accumulation in shellfish. And it's serious, it could kill you if you eat these toxic shellfish. So Maine Department of Marine Resources monitors and manages these fisheries by sampling a bunch of sites across the Maine coast for both Alexandrium abundance, this is a shore-based water sample, as well as they test shellfish tissue for PSP levels. So the goal of this forecast is to predict those shellfish toxicity measurements at least 1 week ahead of time. And this is to aid two types of stakeholders or users. So one, the fishery managers, Maine DMR, who are directing sampling each week, as there are over 500 sampling sites, but they can really only include about 10% of those per week, as well as anticipating harvesting closures and reopening during toxicity. And then the second type of stakeholder or user are industry members. So shellfish growers, harvesters, and dealers who are making business decisions on a weekly basis during these blooms. I really want to highlight this idea of knowledge co-development or co-production. Desiree has mentioned it. It's been a theme of this session. This forecast we've been developing, the stakeholders have been involved since as early as the proposal phase, and we have a very close, tight-knit working relationship with them. So we're making site-specific predictions each week using a machine learning-based classifier. And we're using a binned toxicity classification system, which you can see in the table in the center. The highest class 3, is representing closure level toxicity. That above 80 toxicity units is the FDA regulatory limit for when these fisheries need to be shut down. The classification is based on a probability of each of the 4 classes. So rather than just reporting our predicted classification, we're also delivering the probability of each of the other 3 classes that aren't predicted. We're only using toxicity data as input into this model. There's no Alexandrium abundance being used to predict toxicity levels. And each prediction has a start and end date, which is based on sampling that takes place roughly weekly. However, all the sites aren't sampled on the same day, and sometimes they're more or less than 7 days apart. We've also developed an interactive web page where users can go scroll through on a map of the coast of Maine, find their site if it's included in sampling, or sites that are near them to make their decisions accordingly. So we trialed this forecast with a pilot season last summer, and the forecast did pretty well. So you can see in the confusion matrix in the middle, correct predictions follow that diagonal going up the middle. So out of 533 predictions, we achieved about 94% overall accuracy. And we also successfully predicted 2 of 2 closure level toxicity events. However, the PSP season wasn't very exciting. There were only 2 of these closure level events. On a very toxic year, you could see up to 50 or 60 of these. And one last thing I wanted to point out was that in machine learning, especially classification, the more representation you have of each class, the better that class can get predicted. But as you can see in the histogram on the right, our class 0, or the lowest toxicity class, dominates the training set. So our model is really good at predicting the 0 class, but starts to fall off as we get up the classifications. And one last thing on the left, the scatter is showing the probability we predicted of each of the predictions from last season, the probability of class 3 or closure level toxicity versus the actual measured toxicity the next week. And you can see the regulatory limit at 80 and the 2 that we successfully predicted, but then we also had 3 false alarms. So check out our page. The page is being made available to the public this season, still in an experimental phase, and it still comes with a disclaimer that this forecast should never be used as the basis of decision making, or at least yet. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Hold your questions, please. Don't forget them. And we have Dante Horemans.
All right. Hello, everyone. Indeed, my name is Dante Horemans. I was already introduced by Margie earlier. So, do I have a pointer? So it's written out here, Dante Horemans. So yeah, and I can assure you that my presentation is right now and not tomorrow. So that's great. But okay, so I recently started as VIMS as a postdoctoral researcher, so I'm very excited about that. And today I will really introduce you to the project because I just started. I don't have that many results. It's too preliminary. So let me start with the team. So I'm very pleased to be part of this amazing team. So that's me here. It's an old picture though, and Margie already showed Aaron, Raleigh, and Pierre, but there are also other people as presented here. And let me start with giving you some information on my background. So I have a bachelor and master's degree in physics, so theoretical physics, and I did my PhD at the Department of Biology in Antwerp, in Belgium, in collaboration with Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. So I really combined this theoretical background, this physical theoretical background, with the expertise of the biologist I was directly working with. But it was quite exciting. So my work was very interdisciplinary, and I combined theory and application. So it totally makes sense that I'm part of this team because also here, as we already discussed, there are a lot of fishes, biologists, and also in this team we have biologists, fishes. So it's very interdisciplinary. So it makes sense. So I'm very happy to be here. Okay, so my second slide is on the project itself, a very brief introduction. So as mentioned by Margie, we have this forecasting tool. It already exists, and it predicts specific physical, biochemical parameters. Here are some examples: salinity, temperature, oxygen, pH, and so on. But what we want to do is we want to extend this tool. We want to extend it with forecasting of harmful algal blooms. As Margie mentions, it's important for stakeholders to know where anoxic conditions will occur. But similarly, this is of course not complete. It's a very good start, but there are also other variables that may be important, like our harmful algal blooms. So that's really the objective of this project. Okay, so how we will do that? That's the last slide. So what we will do is we will start with this existing list, these forecasted values of salinity, temperature, and so on. We will use this as input for empirical habitat models. And we already discussed this, but let me explain it again. So here is an example. What is an empirical habitat model? So here, this is a two-dimensional example. On one axis, we have salinity. On the other axis, we have temperature. And this model, so given these two values, it will predict the occurrence of, in this case, sea nettles. But of course, you can extend it using a multi-dimensional space, so more than two variables. But I don't have to explain it here. And the last thing is how we will do that. How will we construct such empirical habitat models? What we will do is we will use the long-term in situ observations in the Chesapeake Bay. And so we have a data set going from 1984 up to now. So we will use this long-term data set. It's also covering almost the full spatial scale of the Chesapeake Bay. So this is very nice. And we will combine this data set with machine learning techniques and statistical models, as already discussed earlier. The techniques I started with are support vector machines and logistic regression. But what's important here is once you have constructed a empirical habitat model, we will use the output of our mechanistic model, this forecast, we plug it into the empirical habitat model, and we will have like a forecast of harmful algal bloom. So that's the main idea. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions later, of course, but you can always contact me here. So here's my email address, and yes, thank you again.
Great. And now we have Tongtong Xu. Correct?
Hello everyone, my name is Tongtong. I'm currently a postdoc at NOAA PSL at Boulder. Today I'm going to talk about the continuum of Northeast Pacific marine heat wave and their relationship to the tropical Pacific. And I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, and they are Matt Newman, Antonietta Capotondi, and Manu Di Lorenzo. So the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave, especially the blood event that happened in the 2013 to 2015, has devastating ecological impact. And this event's evolution is shown on the left column here, and is featured by a large one anomaly in the Northeast Pacific that persists in 2013, and then it extended along the California coast in the 2014, and lastly, it ended up with a strong El Nino event in the tropical Pacific. So the motivation of this study is that the 2013 to 15 Northeast Pacific marine heat wave is not fully understood, and specifically we want to answer, was this a truly unique event, or is it just an exceptionally intense expression of similar recurrent marine heat waves? And also the other question that we would like to answer is, was its intensity and multi-year duration driven by internal extratropical process, or did the tropics play an important role? The first thing that we did is we identified the Northeast Pacific Index, which is shown by these gray box here, and we used the spatially average time series from the observation data set to quantify the frequency of marine heat waves as a function of their intensity and durations, and that's shown in the panel A here. And so this shows that the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave happen more frequently happen less frequently with increasing duration and increasing intensity. And the next thing that we do is we develop the linear inverse model called the LIN to try to simulate large samples of Northeast Pacific marine heat waves. And we also reproduce the same plots as panel A, and is shown in the panel B here. And which shows that our linear inverse model reproduces the statistics of the Northeast Pacific marine heat waves. So that shows that the LIM is capable of reproducing these events statistics, and it also, because it provides a large number of samples, so it also allowed us to analyze their relationship with the tropical Pacific. And we did this by first extracting all of the events for a certain duration and certain intensity, and do a composite, and then extract the Nino 3.4 index and the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave index that were defined earlier, and plot here the concurrent evolution of those Northeast Pacific index and the Nino 3.4 index here. So for example, if you look at one of the blue curve, so it shows that when the tropical Pacific is relatively cool, these Northeast Pacific marine heat waves starts to ramp up with increasing intensity. And the next phase is as the Northeast Pacific marine heat waves stay relatively warm, really warm, the tropical Pacific starts to increase their intensity. And last, the next phase, which is the top here, is that the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave have decreasing intensity, and also the tropical Pacific is starting to decrease as well. And we do this by multiple different durations, and that shows the colors from the light green to the blue. And this really tells us that the tropical, the longer lasting Northeast marine heat waves are associated with the more persistent tropical Pacific variability. So the implication and conclusion from this study is that we think that these Northeast Pacific marine heat waves are a recurrent phenomenon, and we use the linear inverse model to reproduce the statistics of these Northeast Pacific marine heat waves. And specifically, when we apply it to do the forecast of the block events of the average forecast scale, which is evaluated by the anomaly correlation scale, it's about 0.6, so it's reasonably good. And also, this link reproduces the statistics. And lastly, we find that the durations of these marine heat wave events are associated with the tropical Pacific variability. That is all of my presentation, and thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions.
So we'll go back to Emily Norton. Emily, I hope you're there online.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, there
Yes.
Great. Thank you all for hosting a hybrid event, and thanks for your patience with the technical challenges associated with that. So I'm Emily Norton. I'm a research scientist at the University of Washington, CICOES, and I've been working with several co-authors on developing seasonal forecasts to promote dynamic management of the Dungeness crab fishery in Washington and Oregon. Samantha Seidlecki is working on this project, and she gave a really nice introduction in the previous session. But the work was initially motivated by this long-standing observation that the Dungeness crab catch varies widely interannually. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback now.
You sound fine on our end.
Ooh.
It might be your phone if you want to hang that up.
That is muted, so it shouldn't be possible. Maybe it's just a delay.
How's that now?
I think I can still hear myself. I'll turn my volume down and ignore it. So the figure on the left shows the Dungeness crab catch from 2007 through 2019 for Oregon in light blue and Washington in darker blue. And you can see between years, sometimes the catch will almost double. So we found that fisheries managers as well as fishers themselves are interested in forecast products that will help them know what to expect for the upcoming season. So our question here is, can we use modeled ocean conditions to predict this variability in crab catch? Next slide, please. Thanks. So we decided to develop a statistical habitat model, specifically a generalized additive model, to forecast crab catch. So because we are interested in forecasting catch per unit effort, the first thing that we wanted to consider was fishing behavior. So when and where the pots were fished and for how long they were fished. At these locations, we were also interested in other static environmental conditions such as depth and sediment type. That was the first group of predictors that we considered, and we termed those static. The second and third groups of predictors are dynamic oceanography and lagged oceanography. So these are both coming from JScope forecasts and hindcasts or historical simulations. The dynamic conditions are environmental conditions that co-occur with the time that the crabs are caught. So things like temperature, salinity, oxygen concentration, chlorophyll concentration, pH, aragonite, et cetera, et cetera. And then the lag conditions are oceanographic conditions experienced by earlier life stages, because Shanks and other authors have shown that there is a relationship between abundance of earlier life stages, specifically megalopy, and adult crab catch lagged by about 4 years. Other lags have been reported in the literature too, so we explored several different years there. In conclusion, our best model included variables from all three classes of predictor variables. So we had static conditions, but we also found that adding dynamic and lagged oceanography from JScope improved our model fit and skill. Next slide, please. We found that our model skillfully reforecasts catch patterns over time and space, with a caveat that fishing behavior was an important part of this skillful forecast. So Sam showed the figure on the left, but just to recap that our model, this shows average catch versus day and season for fishing seasons from 2007 to 2015, so our model training period, with observed catch in solid lines and predicted catch in dashed lines. And we see that our model captures intraseasonal declines in catch over time, but also interannual variability. The figure in the middle shows our spatial biases in our forecast. So this is presented as a percent bias with under prediction in purple and over prediction in orange. So you can see that over most of the domain, our model tends to slightly under predict catch, but there are a few areas close to shore and close to the shelf break where we have slight over prediction, but in general, our bias is pretty minimal. But both of these reforecasts were generated using known fishing behavior. And we reserved 3 additional test years, 2016, 2017, and 2018, in this table on the right, to do test cases for validation of a true forecast. Because those years are in the past, we do have access to the observed fishing behavior, so we can generate kind of a baseline reforecast using the observed fishing behavior. But in a true forecast sense, we would have to generate a fishing behavior forecast. And one reasonable guess for that would be to use the fishing behavior from 1 year prior, another, and that's in the middle of the table, and then another reasonable guess might be to use the average fishing behaviors from all prior years. But when we use our 2 metrics for skill, either correlation coefficient R or anomaly correlation coefficient, ACC, we see that our model skill declines. All the boxes in red are lower skill than they are if we use the observed fishing behavior. So one need coming out of this work is a need for a better fishing behavior forecast, because that is important to this catch forecast. However, we do also note that the development of the relationships between individual predictor variables and crab catch are still informative for generating a useful forecast. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions later.
So that was great. I think we had some really nice examples. Thank you, Emily. And some of the stuff that I kind of took away from listening to all these different applications was this emphasis that we knew we would hear on working collaboratively with the users from the get-go. Although I really liked that Clarissa mentioned that you had this time to, to keep your mind open about considering other products that might not seem important right now, but that could become useful and relevant in the future. I've had that experience myself. And the other thing is this kind of maybe the challenge of moving not just from the open ocean to the coastal regime, but into the nearshore, and the difficulties of not just getting into the fine scale, but also the land forcing. So we did not get to ask Margie any questions, so I encourage discussion. You already have one? Somebody has one?
We were saying also Clarissa.
And Clarissa, excuse me, and also Clarissa. So if people were retaining those questions, please speak up now.
Yeah, one for actually one for Desiree and one for Margie. So for Margie, so you stressed the importance of the air temperature, Margie, for the hypoxia, and you also showed that the hypoxic condition are not the same everywhere in the bay. So what is the link between the surface air temperature and the hypoxia? So again, I'm revealing my ignorance on this topic.
Is that working?
Yeah.
This is a green light. Hear me?
Yeah.
You have a green light.
A green light. Okay.
Yeah. So in the bay, one of the interesting things we found is that the surface and the bottom are warming equally in time. So the warming signal is so much slower than the residence time of the bay. The surface and the bottom's warming just as much as the surface. That's one thing, and it's two impacts. So the air temperature, first of all, is solubility, simple chemical solubility. So all year long, warm water holds less oxygen, so it's lower in oxygen. And then it's also in the summer, and that's a very significant effect. And then also the rates of photosynthesis and respiration, but particular respiration and remineralization are much higher when the temperatures are higher. So that brings down the oxygen even more in the summer. I think that answers it. Good question.
Did you have a second question, Antonietta?
I did one for this year. Yeah, so I was intrigued by your example of the European project where I think they got some good skill by describing salinity at different levels, and I was curious what is special about salinity, if salinity just directly affects the conditions where the species live in, or if salinity is just a proxy for a type of water masses or origin that will be important for the species.
Yeah, that's a great question. I forwarded you the paper because I'm not an expert at that, but I think it has more to do with that being a proxy than salinity itself affecting the species, and it was also very much associated with temperature. So temperature change versus salinity changes. So.
So I have a question for Clarissa. There she is. You would emphasize kind of the 0 to 12 day forecast window for most applications. But I do know that the West Coast has had some really persistent season-long HABs lately. And I was just kind of curious, what would the value of a longer-term outlook be, given that my impression is that aquaculture response to a HAB is one that takes time and effort, and that there are these longer events. Do you see a role for those longer outlooks, say 3 months, if they can be done with reasonable reliability?
Yeah. Thanks. Is this on? Is it green? You want green?
Yeah.
So it's tricky because I'm starting to, as you were asking that, I was thinking about your experience with the systems and those sorts of those seasonal outlooks for Alexandria and the Gulf of Maine. I think the way I perceive it from the stakeholder perspective in California is, while we might say that we have a bad year coming up or a bad season, unless you can give them a more granular understanding of crossing particular thresholds for toxins
on that shorter time scale, no one is going to close their entire shellfish growing facility for a season. They're going to move the beds around to a lesser optimal place for them. So I'm thinking about the mitigated strategies and what that would require if they had a seasonal outlook. I can't think of too many economically sound options that they would have, knowing that there's a bad season, but if they know if they have a bad week, it's a lot more tractable. On the other hand, if we're talking about Dungeness crab, that seasonal outlook might actually be more useful. But they're still going to rely on the weekly sampling, weekly testing. All of that will still have to happen. So sometimes I wonder just how useful the model could be when you still need to get down into the water sample to do those regulatory things that fisheries have to do. Not very articulate, but it's one I struggle with because I think in theory it would be nice to have a seasonal forecast. But there aren't too many on the ground strategies that I can think of that one would do if they had that seasonal forecast.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the key.
Yeah.
Information, if they can't reposition their aquaculture to sort of maybe a less risk place, then yeah, that's sort of
in terms of Dungeness crab, the crab pots, it's been hot throughout the seasons up in Humboldt, like hot, toxic-wise in the North Coast year after year ever since the Pacific Warm anomaly. And so, again, they're not going to make massive decisions to move crab pots around when really you can't quite escape on average that stage or region over which you're going to have HABs, but it's going to happen in fits and spurts along different parts of the coastline throughout the season. So you kind of just got to deal at that granular scale with these things.
Just to follow up on that, I think we just heard that the behavior of the crab fishers was a huge component of the model of the catch, which suggests that they are changing their behavior all the time, or at least I think it does if I interpret that correctly, right?
They're changing at that seasonal scale. You know what I'm saying? Like I think at that seasonal outlook scale, you're not going to see that. You're going to see it on this daily to weekly kind of response.
Following up on that, I guess a question for Emily. I was curious about what aspect of fishers' behavior is part of the model.
Thank you for the question. We include fishing location and date, so day and season, the amount of time that the pots are left, so the soak time. I think that's it, but then we subsample our oceanographic model at those times and locations to match all of the dynamic and lag conditions to those times and locations. So it's kind of embedded throughout our model.
So I had a question in line with what Clarissa was saying, where sometimes we don't know what we need until it's available and we can use it. And regarding these seasonal time scale, would it be possible that there are some socioeconomic repercussions that we're not aware of until these products are available? So for instance, people go and hoard gas when they hear that it might be depleted, right? Or there's lots of reinsurance companies that use climate forecast information. So what if restaurant businesses knew that it would be a bad year for fisheries? Would they drive up the prices and that would help compensate for the fishermen that will have a worse or things like that, that we haven't seen those connections, or maybe some people have seen those connections and perhaps could just comment on that.
I can kind of briefly comment on the HAB part. So we don't have data on that sort of thing in California, but there have been a number of studies in Florida who have looked at that human dimensions component, and you do see that economic response to bad Carenia brevis forecasts over a period of time, and you see that in the restaurant industry. So you're saying there's definitely a lot of validity there. And there actually are a lot of things people can do. I was just talking to Sam and thinking about Charlie's question. In California, and this might be true in other parts of the Pacific Northwest, I do know that crab fishermen are often they don't solely fish crab, they have other options, salmon being one of them. And so they do, what I have heard is that if they've invested all their money that year in crab pots, it's hard to then switch to do salmon. But if they knew ahead of time at that seasonal level, maybe they could invest in different gear. So I hadn't thought about that when you asked me, but that's another thing.
I have a question for Antonietta. The limb model that you looked at, was it state variable? Did it include atmospheric state as well, or was it just sea surface salinity, sea surface temperature and sea surface cycle?
Was only ocean variables, sea surface temperature and sea surface height at monthly means of these variables. And so sea surface height seemed to be very useful. In fact, for this optimal initial condition was seem to be initial condition in sea surface height seem to be really key. I think it's a measure of ocean heat content, so there's some indication of subsurface processes.
I guess I asked because I thought about the marine heat wave as a coupled system where changes in the ocean low lead to an extended high pressure system over an area. And so I guess I'm wondering if would there be a different optimal state if you considered atmospheric variables as well?
So one thing that you can go to, because I wanted to stay in my 5 minutes to give a good example. Once you have your initial conditions, and then you can actually project at those fields on your data and time series, then you can do linear regression of some atmospheric variables. So you have some contours of sea level pressure, which are actually consistent with what we think. So the initial pattern was like a Pacific oscillation pattern, and then once you start having warm anomaly in the tropical Pacific, you develop a nickel evolution law, which is more consistent with that. So there is definitely that connection between the surface temperature and the atmospheric variables that also leads to this increased persistence depending that Tongtong was talking about. While I think the tropics and the connections and the response of the atmosphere to the surface temperature can explain the longer duration, I think the amplitude is most likely due to local atmospheric forcing, which is stochastic in time compared to faster time scales. And I think to get into that dimension, we probably need to go higher in temporal resolution than the macro resolution today.
Hi, I just had 3 questions. I had one first for I wanted to hear more about the static, dynamic, and lagged predictor variables. What are those exactly, and what are the differences between those 3? I was super curious about how incorporating lags. Like what time scale are the lags at?
Was that for me? I think or Sam. Yeah, so the static conditions are happening at the time and location where the fishing is happening, and those are really focused on conditions that we don't expect to change over time. So like benthic sediment type, latitude and longitude, all the fishing behavior, like the soak time. That's the big one. And then for the dynamic conditions, those are monthly average fields from JScope. And they are subsampled from the model at the times and locations where those plots were set. The lag conditions are subsampled from JScope hindcast, so historical simulations, and those were lagged 3 or 4 years. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I had a question for Marjorie, if no one else has questions. I had a question about the confidence or uncertainty in the mid-century projections. I was really curious about what type of uncertainty were you mainly focusing on? Is it like uncertainty that comes from the data or the methodology, or is there I could also imagine there might be this deeper uncertainty related to maybe the interactions between species that are really difficult to capture, or the evolutionary dynamics at play that might cause uncertainty in your models for your final predictions. I wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what Kyle really focused on was just three things, and you just mentioned a whole bunch of uncertainty from a whole bunch of different, so there's a lot of uncertainty, but he was really looking, the way he conducted the experiment was to look at the relative uncertainty of which GCM you chose, which downscaling method you chose, and which watershed model you chose. So those were really the three that he was looking at, but you just pointed out that there's lots of other sources of uncertainty. So those were the three that we were looking at, and in fact, and folks always ask, well, what about emission scenario? Because that's something that is also another certain source of uncertainty in the future. But it turns out by 2050, that's really not significant compared to which GCM you choose. So that didn't play a role. But yeah, so those were the three you looked at, but there's that, that's a good point that we're underestimating the uncertainty if we're only looking at those three, because there's lots of other sources of uncertainty too.
Thank you. And then my last question was just for a lot of people use machine learning methods and designing your models. And I was curious about machine learning models suffer from this problem of sometimes they can be really difficult to interpret. Right? They can seem like a black box, and they can only focus on it. Sometimes they can only make these correlative conclusions instead of getting at the real cause. And I was wondering if people here had thought about how to get around that. How do you make these systems more interpretable? How can you more directly compare them to mechanistic models to get underlying mechanisms of a lot of the processes that we're looking at? That's my idea. So if people want to talk about this later, that would be cool.
Ethan's talk might get on that tomorrow, but is he here?
There's probably multiple ways to answer this question, but or if there's an answer, one to answer. But, ideas, the correlative analysis, I think, can be suggestive of mechanisms and allow you to develop hypotheses to explore further, because these models provide such vast quantities of data that sometimes it's hard to navigate where you should look. And then, the mechanistic side can then be explored in these realistic simulations that are, and then there's the challenge, where is it? Because the reanalysis are really tempting, but in some cases, the act of doing the reanalysis influences the answers you might get, right? So you kind of have to find the right workhorse to investigate that with. And in biogeochemistry, we often rely on budgets for a lot of it, but there's other approaches for that too. And happy to talk more, and I would love to hear what other people think too.
I can add to that a little bit, fleshing it out in ways I didn't get to in my talk because I was going a million miles per hour. But the thing I didn't tell you, when we were building the demoic acid model in the early days, we were constraining that around a lot of different, starting with correlations, building GLMs, thinking about really just basic statistics of what's driving demoic acid in situ. And what kept coming out, and it's come out in a lot of different studies since then in California, is that there are these nutrient ratios that seem to be important. So then we took that and started to build some mechanistic understanding from that. May or may not be right. Time will tell. We might embed it in like a 3D model and see if it stacks up relative to what we know happened. And I think, just building on what Sam said, that's a pretty practical way to think about that leap. And you can do that with machine learning output as well.
One more is that the fun thing about models is that you can also turn pieces off and discover what the role of that is, and that. But that needs to also, there's obviously things to caution yourself with there too. But that's been a powerful thing for attribution. It's just kind of what you're getting at, right?
And that salinity example is a great case. I've seen that happen before, where you're really looking at a process of dilution, vertical mixing, and stratification, but salinity is the proximate variable that shows up. It's not what's mechanistically causing anything.
Yeah, and just speaking about the work that colleagues at Dante I work closely with, so Armoring and others are using those regression trees, even other machine learning techniques in terms of developing species distribution models. And I think somebody talked about it before, but obviously overfitting, problems, so doing cross-validation, and then, but also extrapolation. So, the training data that you have will determine, that's constraining sort of their performance in terms of, let's say, the temperature response over the temperature that they have seen in the training data. But then, if you're using those for projections, for instance, they can give you all sorts of responses that are not really biologically plausible, for instance. And if you use different models, they actually will do different things and then extrapolating, so it's important to think about that. And now there are some these shape constraint models that you can constrain the shape of that relationship, even if it's a machine learning model, between your SST or other variable and biological output that you're interested in.
Hi everyone. Breakout time. We've got, so I put this list on everybody's table because there were some snafus with the email list this morning, but hopefully you also finally got the email because I had May send it because it clearly didn't like me. But I put a printout of these on each table for all of you in-person folks so you know where to go. And all of the online participants have already been assigned, and we will automatically put you in your breakout rooms. We're going to meet again. It's going to be an hour total, so please spend the first 45 minutes or so in discussion, and then take 10-15 minutes at the end to wrap up and create your slide. If anyone has any questions, come talk to me. We're back here at 5:30.
I have no idea, but I think so. Awesome. Thank you very much. So Val will bring it. Okay.
It's a very easy